Hi, my name is Ben Livneh with the University of Colorado, and in this lecture I'm going to talk about groundwater. We'll define the types of groundwater and the timescales associated with it, how it fits into our overall water consumption, where we get it from, and potential concerns for the future of groundwater resources going forward. What is groundwater? It's subsurface water below the water table in saturated soils and geologic formations called aquifers. Groundwater typically originates as either rainwater or snowmelt that does not flow overland, but rather percolates and is stored in the soil and bedrock within the tiny spaces between the soil and rock particles. Although groundwater makes up only a small portion of the Earth's total water, that is 1.7%, it constitutes approximately 30% of the total fresh water, making it an important water resource. It's also worth noting that over 50% of groundwater is saline, that is, contains high salt concentrations. So despite its slow-moving nature, groundwater is never completely static, it's always moving. As the diagram shows, the nature of groundwater movement is determined by the characteristics of aquifers, soil, and confining layers of subsurface rocks. The rate of water moving below the ground depends on the permeability, that is, how much resistance the water experiences to move, as well as the porosity, that is, the amount of open space within the subsurface material. If the subsurface is highly permeable or porous, then the groundwater can move significant distance in a number of days. However, groundwater can also sink into deep aquifers where it takes centuries or millennia to move back to the environment, or even go into deeper groundwater storage where it can stay for even longer. So now let's define the two types of aquifers. First are unconfined aquifers that contain water that has simply infiltrated and has saturated the subsurface. Pumping is required to bring these waters to the surface. On the other hand, confined aquifers contain water that is essentially sandwiched between rock above and below that is not very permeable. This confinement can cause natural pressure in the aquifer that can sometimes be enough to push the water up through a well to the land surface, and this is called artesian water. Although some aquifers produce artesian water, that is, water that comes to the surface without pumping, artesian water is not always produced by confined aquifers as it depends on the pressure of the system. According to the U.S. Geologic Survey, the USGS, in 2005, 20% of total water withdrawals came from groundwater sources. Only a very small portion, 4% of the total groundwater, was saline, and this went mostly to mining operations. Almost 99% of all groundwater use came from freshwater aquifers. In total, about 23% of the freshwater used in 2005 came from groundwater, with the remaining 77% coming from surface water. Groundwater is an especially important water resource in places like the arid West that lack adequate surface water resources. It often takes more costs and more energy to access groundwater, but where there is little surface water, groundwater can be used critically to meet societal water needs. Exploring the contribution of groundwater together with total water consumption since 1950 shows us that it has always been a small but important component of our water supply. Interestingly, despite population increases, shown in pink, groundwater usage has held roughly constant in recent decades and has actually declined slightly in 2010 by about 13% since 2005. This bar chart shows groundwater use by category, where most of the fresh groundwater withdrawals, that is 68%, went to irrigation, while 19% was used for public supply purposes, mainly for drinking water. Groundwater is also crucial for those people who supply their own water. This is called domestic use, as over 98% of self-supplied domestic groundwater withdrawals came from groundwater, such as through wells. Thermoelectric use, on the other hand, is small, since nearly all thermoelectric water comes from surface water, either to drive turbines behind dams or cool equipment. To understand who the biggest consumers of groundwater are, this map shows groundwater withdrawals by state for 2005. In the West, California is the primary groundwater user, where most of the water goes towards agriculture, while Texas, Nebraska, Colorado, and Kansas are also important in the high plains and in the west. It is estimated that 99% of groundwater originates in large aquifers. This map from the USGS shows the major aquifers of the United States. Important and large aquifers in the western U.S. include the Central Valley Aquifer System, the Ogallala Aquifer in the Great Plains in Texas, as well as the Colorado Plateau aquifers. It is important to understand the major threats to groundwater resources going forward. The first concern is excessive pumping. Pumping water out of the ground faster than it is replenished can cause groundwater depletion, which is primarily observed in operations involving sustained groundwater pumping. Some of the negative effects of groundwater depletion include drying up of wells, increased pumping costs, deterioration of water quality, and reduction of water in streams and lakes. Also, groundwater can be directly contaminated by both natural and human activities. Overall, greater awareness and policy are needed to ensure that groundwater will be a viable water resource for the future. Pumping groundwater faster than it can be recharged can have negative effects on both the environment and on water users. The most severe consequence of excessive groundwater pumping is that the water table, below which the ground is saturated, can be lowered, as seen in this figure for both active and dry wells. For water to be drawn from the ground, it must be pumped from a well that reaches below the water table. During pumping, a cone of depression can be created around the pumping site. If groundwater levels decline too far, then the well owner may have to deepen the well or drill a new well altogether. Also, as water levels decline, the rate of water that a well can yield may decline and the earth above the well may subside. As the depth to water increases, the water must be lifted higher to reach the land surface, and such more energy and cost are required to extract the water. As water tables are drawn down, the quality of groundwater may also be degraded. Drawdown can lead to things like saltwater intrusion, and it can have other harmful impacts on the ecosystem, as it can change how water moves between an aquifer system, streams, lakes, and wetlands. Groundwater depletion has been a concern in the Southwest and High Plains for many years. However, as shown in this map, increased demands on our groundwater resources have overstressed aquifers in many areas of the nation, not just in arid regions. It is worth noting that groundwater depletion can occur over a wide range of spatial scales, from large aquifers all the way down to a single well. The severity of groundwater depletion depends on several factors, including pumping rate, physical properties of the aquifer, natural and human-driven recharge rates. Now, groundwater contamination can come in various forms, both natural and man-made. Arsenic contamination of groundwater is often caused by naturally occurring high concentrations of arsenic in deep groundwater. A drinking water standard of 50 parts per billion of arsenic, or 50 ppb, was originally established by the United States Public Health Service in 1942. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, more recently updated this standard to 10 parts per billion in 2006. Many public water supply systems in the U.S. obtained their water from groundwater supplies that had met the old 50 ppb standard but exceeded the new standard. These utilities were forced to either find alternative supply or inexpensive means to treat the arsenic in the water. In Arizona and California, it is estimated that more than 30% of water supply wells were put out of compliance by the new regulation. Nitrate, on the other hand, comes from nitrogen, a plant nutrient supplied by inorganic fertilizer and animal manure. Beneath agricultural lands, shown in the figure, nitrate is the primary form of nitrogen and is soluble in water and can easily pass through the soil into the groundwater. Nitrate can persist in groundwater for decades and accumulate to high levels as more nitrogen is applied to the land surface every year. Other forms of contamination include chemical spills and leaks of gasoline in storage tanks. If rainwater comes into contact with contaminated soil while seeping into the ground, it can become polluted and carry the pollution from the soil to the groundwater. In the United States, water management is largely decentralized. with each state maintaining significant authority and autonomy when addressing groundwater regulation. For this reason, it is not possible to describe groundwater governance with a single overarching rule. Rather, it's necessary to look at individual state practices and approaches to groundwater management. The following passage describes the state of groundwater governance. Groundwater governance is the process by which groundwater is managed through the application of responsibility, participation, information availability, transparency, custom, and rule of law. It is the art of coordinating administrative actions and decision-making between and among different jurisdictional levels. Therefore, in order to ensure adequate supply of groundwater resources for the future, increased awareness and sensible governance are needed to manage this important water resource. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something.